The phone hit the kitchen floor before I could stop it, skidding across the tile and spinning to a stop against the cabinet. My son's voice was still coming through the speaker, even after I'd fumbled it out of my hand. "Dad, just listen to me for once. You're sitting on that money like it's going to save your life. It won't. You're 68 years old." I picked up the phone slowly. My back protested the way it always does when I bend too fast. "I'm 68 years old," I said, "and it took me 41 years of working the line at Granger Steel to save that money. Every word came out measured. Every word can't be something." Tyler didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear his wife in the background, that low murmur she does when she's coaching him through a conversation she's too smart to lead herself. "Dad, we're not asking for all of it. We just need enough to cover the down payment on the Scottsdale property. Once we flip it, we pay you back with interest. That's not a request, that's an investment opportunity." Investment. The word sat in my mouth like a piece of gravel. I'd heard that word 4 times in 3 years. First, it was the food truck that lasted 11 months. Then it was the cryptocurrency thing I still don't fully understand. Then the rental property in Phoenix that had foundation issues they swore they didn't know about. And now a flip house in Scottsdale while the market was cooling and Tyler hadn't held a steady job since before the pandemic. "I'm going to think about it," I said. "That's what you always say when the answer is no," he said. The line went dead. My wife, Dorothy, had been standing in the doorway the whole time, a dish towel folded over her forearm, the way she's carried one for 35 years of marriage. She didn't say anything. She crossed the kitchen and picked up the coffee mug I'd set on the counter and handed it to me. "He's going to call back," she said. "He always does." He didn't call back that night. He called 3 more times the next morning, and when I didn't answer, he texted, "Dad, I need an answer by Friday. This is a real window." Then, 20 minutes later, "You know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Then, an hour after that, "Kendra says hi." Kendra was his wife. She'd never once texted me herself. I set the phone face down on my workshop table and went back to the birdhouse I'd been building for Dorothy's garden. Cedar planks, a copper roof, the kind of slow work that keeps my hands busy and my mind from chewing itself apart. I'd been building things in that workshop for 20 years. It was the one place in our house where nobody needed anything from me. Friday came and went. I didn't call. Saturday morning arrived the way June mornings do in Tucson, bright and already too hot by 7. I was on the back porch with my coffee when Dorothy opened the screen door behind me. "There's something on the front porch," she said. "A box. I almost tripped over it getting the paper." I wasn't expecting anything. Dorothy knew better than I did what came through our mail. She handled most of it since I retired. I followed her through the house to the front door and looked down. It was a cardboard box, maybe the size of a hat box, sitting directly in front of the door like someone had placed it by hand rather than left it by a delivery driver. No shipping label. No stamps. Just my name written in black marker on the top. Theodore Marsh. Not Ted, which is what everyone calls me. Theodore, the full name from my birth certificate that I almost never use. I crouched down. My knees made their usual complaints. "There's no postage," I said. Dorothy was behind me, and I heard her breath catch. "Ted, don't touch it." I looked up at her. Her face had gone still in the particular way it does when she's frightened and trying not to show it. She pointed at the side panel of the box. There were holes, small ones punched in a pattern around all 4 sides. Deliberate. Evenly spaced. "Those are air holes," she said. "Something's alive in there." I stood up slowly and took a step back from the box. The morning felt suddenly different. The neighbours' sprinklers were running, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking, and the whole ordinary Saturday had a sharp, wrong quality underneath it. "Who would put a live animal on our porch?" I said. Wasn't really a question. Dorothy's eyes met mine. Neither of us said his name. "Get away from the door," she said. "I'm calling 911. She had her phone out before I could respond. I backed into the house, and she pulled the door mostly shut, leaving it open just an inch. From the gap, I watched the box on the porch like it might move. It didn't. But I stood there watching it anyway. She was already talking to the dispatcher, her voice low and steady, giving our address on Crestwood Drive, explaining the situation in the clear, organised way she explains everything. Unmarked package left on the doorstep. Holes in the sides consistent with ventilation. No postage, no return address. We have no idea who left it or when. The dispatcher told us to stay inside and away from the package. Officers would be there within 10 minutes. Dorothy hung up and stood beside me at the door. The box hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't moved. But then, from inside it, came a sound. Low. A dry, papery rustling. Like something shifting position in a confined space. Something thin and patient. She grabbed my arm. The rustling stopped. Then it came again, slightly longer. I knew that sound. I'd grown up in rural Texas, and I knew exactly what that sound was. And standing there in my own doorway on a Saturday morning in the house where we'd raised our kids and refinished the floors and planted the lemon tree that Dorothy loved, I felt a cold, simple fury begin to settle in my chest like sediment dropping to the bottom of still water. 2 officers arrived in 11 minutes. The younger one, a woman named Officer Callahan according to her nameplate, took one look at the box and called for animal control without any discussion. The other officer, older, heavy-set, stood with us in the entryway and asked the questions I'd been preparing myself for. Any idea who might have left this? I looked at Dorothy. We had an argument with our son recently, I said, about money. He wanted access to part of our retirement savings for a real estate investment, and we declined. The officer wrote something in his notepad. How recently? About a week ago. Things got heated. Any direct threats? I thought about Tyler's text. You're sitting on that money like it's going to save your life. No direct threats, I said, just pressure. The animal control unit arrived 22 minutes after the police. The specialist was a compact, efficient man named Patterson who put on heavy gloves and carried a clear plastic container the size of a small suitcase. He didn't seem alarmed. He told us to wait inside, examine the box for less than a minute, and then opened it with the practiced calm of someone who has done this many times. He carried the container inside 5 minutes later. Through the clear plastic, I could see it. A western diamondback rattlesnake, thick-bodied, maybe 4 feet, alive and agitated, coiling against the walls of the container. Patterson set it on our coffee table, which is where I keep my copy of Woodworking magazine and the reading glasses I'm always losing, and told us it appeared healthy and uninjured. Someone had packed it in there recently. It hadn't been in there long enough to be in distress from the heat. Someone who knew what they were doing, he said. This wasn't a grab-it-and-go situation. You need a hook, a bag, a container. This was planned. He took it to his vehicle. Officer Callahan came inside and sat across from us and asked whether we wanted to file a formal report. Dorothy looked at me. I thought about Tyler, about his voice on the phone the week before, that tight entitled frustration of a man who has never learned that no is a complete sentence. I thought about his wife Kendra, who coaches him through every conversation from the wings. I thought about our 2 grandchildren, Mia, who was 9, and loved horses, and Connor, who was 7, and still sometimes fell asleep in my recliner watching baseball with me on Sunday evenings. Not yet, I said. Officer Callahan wrote something and looked up. Sir, I want to be clear. Leaving a venomous snake on someone's property is a felony in Arizona under the criminal threatening statute. If you have reasonable suspicion about who did this, that information matters. I understand, I said. I need a day to think. She gave us her card. They left. Dorothy and I sat in our living room for a long time without speaking. The coffee table still had the faint rectangular impression from Patterson's container. I kept looking at it. Do you know it was him? Dorothy asked finally. Not for certain, I said. But you think so. The timing, I said. The name on the box. Theodore. Nobody calls me Theodore. Tyler knows that. He knows it bothers me, that full name. He used to use it when he was a teenager trying to be cutting. Theodore, can I have the car? Theodore, you're being unreasonable. Dorothy pressed her lips together. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. Call him. I looked at her. Don't accuse him, she said. Just call and talk like nothing happened, like a normal Saturday call. You'll know by how he answers. She has always been smarter than me about people. It's one of the reasons I married her. I picked up my phone and dialed Tyler's number. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice was careful, the artificial brightness of someone waiting to find out how much trouble they're in. "Just calling to check in," I said. "How's your weekend going?" "Fine," he said. "Good. We took the kids to the splash pad yesterday. Kinda got sunburned." I waited. Through the phone I could hear his breathing, slightly faster than normal. Then I heard his wife's voice in the background, very low, asking something, and I heard his short, quiet laugh. Not amusement. The other kind. The kind of laugh that leaks out when you're nervous and something is going according to plan and you can't quite contain it. That was all I needed. "Good talk," I said. "Give Kendra my best." I hung up before he could respond. Dorothy read my face without asking. "I'm not calling the police yet," I said. "I'm going to do something better." I went to my workshop and I sat on my stool and I didn't touch the birdhouse. I just sat there for an hour. Outside the window, the saguaro in our backyard stood in the late morning heat like they'd been standing there since before any of us were born, patient and indifferent and built to survive things that would kill most plants. I've always liked that about saguaros. Then I came inside and went to my office and opened my laptop. I want to explain what I did because there's a version of this story where an angry father acts impulsively, and that's not what happened. What I did took about 4 hours of careful, methodical work. I'd been putting it off for years, telling myself there was time, telling myself the situation would improve. It hadn't improved. I started with the estate documents. Dorothy and I had done our wills 9 years ago through an attorney named Charles Whitfield, who had an office in Midtown Tucson and coached Little League on weekends. Basic stuff. The house to the surviving spouse. Remaining assets split equally between Tyler and his sister Renata. Standard. It felt fair when we wrote it. It didn't feel fair anymore. I emailed Whitfield that afternoon. He'd handled enough family situations that I didn't have to explain much. I told him we needed to restructure, that we wanted to establish a trust for the grandchildren's education, and that we wanted to remove Tyler as a direct beneficiary. He wrote back within the hour. "Could you come in Monday morning?" While I was at the desk, I went through our financial accounts. Tyler had never had direct access to our savings, but I'd made the mistake years ago of listing him as an emergency contact on one of my older accounts from a bank I rarely used anymore. I called the bank and had it changed to Renata. Then I sat back and looked at my hands for a while. Tyler didn't know it yet, but the house on Crestwood Drive, our retirement accounts, the investments Dorothy and I had spent 4 decades building, none of it was going to go the direction he'd been planning. The flip house in Scottsdale was going to require a different backer. Dorothy knocked on the office door around 5. "I ordered pizza," she said. "The kind with the artichokes before you say anything." "I don't like artichokes," I said. "I know," she said. "I like them. Sit with me." I followed her to the kitchen table and we ate pizza while the evening light moved across the floor and the neighbor's cat appeared and disappeared in the lemon tree outside. Dorothy didn't ask what I'd done in the office. She'd lived with me long enough to know I'd tell her when I was ready. I told her after the pizza. She listened carefully. When I got to the part about taking Tyler off the estate documents, she set down her water glass. "And Renata?" she asked. "Everything we would have left Tyler goes to a trust," I said, "for Mia and Connor. Educational expenses managed by a third party. Not Tyler, not Kendra. Someone neither of them can pressure." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "That's permanent." "What he put on our porch was permanent," I said. She looked down at the table, nodded slowly. She didn't cry, which is not because she's a hard woman. It's because she'd been crying quietly for several months, in the small doses that people cry when something they love is ending. So gradually there's no single moment to point to. The snake on the porch had just been the moment she could finally point to. Tyler called Sunday evening. I didn't answer. He called twice more Monday morning before 9. I was already sitting in Whitfield's waiting room, which smells like old coffee and carpet cleaner and the particular quiet of a place where people come to make serious decisions. There were magazines from 4 months ago on the side table. I didn't read them. Whitfield took me through everything systematically. The trust documents for Mia and Connor, the amendment to our wills, a conversation about whether we wanted to pursue any legal action related to the Saturday incident. I told him what Officer Callahan had told us about the Arizona statute. He leaned back. "You could file today," he said. "It's a serious charge. Depending on what evidence there is, it could result in criminal prosecution." I thought about Mia, who loved horses, Connor, asleep in my recliner with the baseball game still going. I thought about what a felony charge would do to their family, to their mother's income, to what it would mean to be 7 years old with your father facing criminal charges. "Not yet," I said, for the second time that weekend. Whitfield looked at me steadily. He'd been a family attorney for over 20 years. He'd heard this before. "The documents will be finished by Thursday," he said. "Once they're signed and filed, the estate plan is legally binding. Tyler will have no claim on anything beyond what you choose to give him directly during your lifetimes." "Which will be nothing," I said. Whitfield nodded and wrote something down. I called Renata from the parking garage after I left. She's 4 years younger than Tyler, lives in Portland, teaches high school biology. She has a mother's steadiness and none of Tyler's appetite for shortcuts. We'd always been close in the quiet, undemonstrative way that fathers and daughters sometimes are, built on small things. Her calling to tell me when the salmon were running in the Columbia River, me sending her pictures of the birdhouses. When I told her what had happened, she was silent for a long time. "Dad," she said finally, "you're sure it was Tyler?" "I'm not 100% certain," I said, "but I'm certain enough." She asked me about the grandchildren. I told her about the trust. I could hear her crying, the soft, surprised kind, like she hadn't expected to be moved by something she'd probably been half expecting for years. "He's been like this since we were kids," she said quietly. "You always gave him another chance. We all did." "I know," I said. I drove home through the midday Tucson heat, past the strip malls and the bougainvillea and the gas stations, the ordinary geography of a life built here over 30 years. Dorothy was in the garden when I pulled in, kneeling by the raised bed we put in last spring. She looked up and read my face and went back to her work. Tyler showed up Wednesday evening. I'd been expecting it. Dorothy had made dinner and we'd eaten, and I was in the workshop sanding the copper fittings for the birdhouse roof when I heard his truck in the driveway. I set down the sandpaper and washed my hands at the utility sink and walked to the back door. He was on the back porch when I came out. His face had the look of a man who has prepared a speech. His wife hadn't come, which told me something. When Kendra doesn't come, he's improvising. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about what happened." I sat in my porch chair. I didn't offer him a seat. "What happened?" I said. He shifted his weight. "The box. On the porch." "That wasn't," he stopped. He started again. "I want you to know that wasn't supposed to go that far." There it was, not a denial, an explanation of intent. I'd spent 41 years on a factory floor learning to read people who were managing bad news. I heard everything I needed in those 9 words. "What was I supposed to do?" I said. He looked at the yard. "Scare you a little. Kendra found a guy online. It was stupid. We weren't thinking." He looked back at me. "You weren't listening." "You needed me to be scared enough to give you money," I said. He flinched. "How much?" I said. He blinked. "What? How much were you planning to ask for after I was good and scared?" He looked away again. $250,000, he said quietly, half the equity on the house. I sat with that number for a moment. $250,000, the product of 4 decades of overtime shifts and skipped vacations and the years Dorothy worked the school district job she didn't love because it had good benefits, and we were trying to plan ahead for exactly this period of our lives, the quiet part, the part we'd earned. "That money is not available," I said. "Dad, come on, we can work something out. The Scottsdale deal is real. I have a contact at the title company. I can show you the numbers." "The Scottsdale deal," I said, "is not my problem." Tyler's jaw tightened. "So what, you're just going to cut me off? Because of one stupid mistake?" I looked at my son. He was 41 years old, with the same eyes he'd had as a boy, and somewhere behind the entitlement and the poorly managed desperation, there was still the kid who used to follow me around this yard, asking me the names of things. The bird, the plant, the tool. "What's that one called, Dad?" And I'd told him every time, because that's what fathers do, they answer. I answered him now. "I've been to see my attorney," I said. "Our estate plan has been restructured. The grandchildren have an educational trust in their names, managed by an independent trustee. Your sister is the executor of our estate. You're not a beneficiary." He stared at me. "That's not," he started. "You can't just—" I stood up. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said. "I'm doing it because I've spent 15 years watching you make choices I couldn't protect you from, and trying anyway. I gave you money and you lost it. I gave you time and you misused it. I gave you patience and you used it to figure out what I was afraid of. There's nothing left for me to give that would actually help you." The anger that moved across his face was the kind that comes when something true has been said by someone who has no reason to lie. "What am I supposed to do?" he said. "Get a job," I said, "a real one, for more than a year. Handle your own bills. Love your children in the ways that cost you something other than my money." He stood there for another moment. Then he walked off the porch and across the yard to his truck. He backed out of the driveway without looking at the house. Dorothy appeared at the back door. "How did it go?" she said. "He admitted it," I said, "not directly, but enough." She came and stood beside me on the porch. We stood there as the evening settled into the yard, the bats coming out the way they do in Tucson at dusk, moving against the pale sky in their quick, angular way. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I've finished the birdhouse," I said. She laughed. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in a while. It was the real one, the small, unguarded one that she only does when something surprises her. The documents were finalized Thursday, as Whitfield had promised. We signed in his office, Dorothy and I, at a desk that had probably held 100 other families making decisions like this one. My handwriting looked the same as always. I don't know what I expected. That something would feel different in my hand when you're signing papers that mean your son has been written out of your life in any practical sense. It felt the same. But when I set the pen down, I felt the thing I'd been waiting to feel for 3 days. Not satisfaction exactly, something quieter. The specific relief of a man who has finally done the thing that needed doing. The thing he'd been putting off because doing it meant admitting it was necessary. We drove home through the late afternoon. The mountains to the east had the particular colour they get in June. Pale purple in the distance, the Rincons going soft in the heat haze. Dorothy had her window down and her arm resting on the doorframe the way she does on long drives, and she was watching the landscape with the expression she wears when she's at peace with something. She knew something I didn't say, which was that I still hoped Tyler would find his way to something better. I still hoped that without the possibility of rescue, he might discover the version of himself that could actually do it on his own. The version that must be in there somewhere, underneath all the bad decisions and the misdirected anger. The version that was still, on some level, the boy who used to follow me around the yard asking the names of things. Maybe he would. Maybe Mia and Connor would grow up and go to college on the trust I'd set aside, and come see me in this house when I was old, and we'd sit on the back porch, and they'd tell me what their father had become. Maybe Tyler would walk through that door himself one day, older, quieter, ready to be known as something other than the man who put a rattlesnake on his father's porch. I didn't know. I couldn't know. What I knew was that the birdhouse needed one more day of work, and that Dorothy had bought a new rosemary plant for the garden that still needed to go in the ground, and that on Sunday I was hoping Connor would come over and watch the game with me the way we do, if his mother allowed it, which might be a different question now, and that the morning would come regardless, bright and hot and full of the ordinary business of living, which I intended to do for as long as I was able, on my own terms, without apology. I keep thinking about those saguaros in our backyard, the ones that have been standing out there since before we bought this house, since before the neighbourhood was built, probably. They don't grow fast. Most people don't realise that a saguaro takes 75 years just to grow its first arm. 75 years of desert heat and frost and drought, and it just keeps at it, quietly, without anyone watching. There's something in that I've been turning over in my mind since the morning Dorothy found that box on our porch. What happened to my son didn't happen overnight, and if I'm honest with myself, neither did my part in it. I spent years writing checks I told myself were investments in his future, and what I was actually investing in was the idea that love and money were the same currency. They're not. I know that now, in a way, I didn't at 50, or even at 60. When Tyler stood on my back porch and told me the snake was just supposed to scare me a little, I understood something I'd been refusing to understand for a long time. I hadn't raised a man who lacked opportunity. I'd raised a man who had never been asked to sit with the consequence long enough to learn anything from it. That was on him, and some of it was on me. There's a version of doing right by your children that looks like protection but functions like harm. You tell yourself you're building a safety net, but what you're actually building is a floor they never have to stand on themselves. And the longer the floor holds, the less they believe they can stand without it. Tyler believed that. By the end, I think he was more afraid of his own self-sufficiency than he was of losing the money. The money wasn't really the point. The point was the proof that he could call and something would happen, that he still had that kind of power over my life. Understanding that didn't make what he did forgivable, it just made it legible. What I had to find at 68 years old was the discipline to see clearly and act on what I saw. Not out of anger, though there was anger. Not out of grief, though there was plenty of that too. Out of the plain recognition that continuing to do what I'd always done would produce more of what I'd already gotten. Dorothy would tell you I sat in that workshop for a long time before I came inside to make the calls I needed to make. She'd be right. I needed to think it through completely, not react. There's a difference between a decision and a reaction, and the difference is usually time and honesty with yourself about your own role and how things got to where they are. The trust for Mia and Connor is the thing I feel clearest about. Whatever happens between Tyler and me, those two children didn't make any of these choices. They deserve to have something waiting for them that no one can argue over or drain or leverage. That's not revenge. That's just a grandfather doing the only concrete thing he can still do from a distance. I don't know what kind of man my son becomes from here. I genuinely don't. But I know what kind of man I intend to be for whatever time I have left. And it's the kind who finishes the birdhouse, plants the rosemary, sits on the porch in the evening when the bats come out, and doesn't wait by the phone for someone to need something from him. That's not coldness. That's a life I built and intend to live.